Elias lived with Clara, a woman everyone described as sweet, calm, almost angelic. But she had a very precise way of punishing people. If you upset her, she erased you. One evening, after a trivial disagreement, Elias expected a normal argument. Instead, Clara gave him a faint, almost polite smile and walked away. That was day one. They lived in the same apartment, slept in the same bed, shared the same kitchen. But if he spoke, Clara didn't react. If he stood in front of her, she simply walked past him. For a whole month, she treated him like a ghost. Elias tried everything to provoke a reaction, but reaction never came. By the third week, Elias started questioning his own sanity. Finally, one day, Clara looked at him and calmly said, "I hope you've learned the lesson." Elias felt nothing but relief, because after a month of being invisible, even a single word felt like oxygen.
What Elias experienced wasn't just a bad fight or someone needing space. It was something far more deliberate. In psychology, this tactic is known as the silent treatment. But in its more extreme form, it falls under something darker: ostracism. Ostracism means being deliberately ignored or excluded as a form of control. And for the human brain, that's not a small thing. We're wired to survive through connection. Recognition from other people isn't just emotional comfort, it's part of how our brain regulates safety. When someone close to you suddenly acts as if you don't exist, your brain doesn't process it like a normal argument, it processes it like a threat. In fact, studies have shown that social exclusion activates the same brain regions associated with physical pain. That's exactly why this tactic can be so powerful. Now, keep this in mind. Once you understand why this silence hurts so much, you can actually learn to turn that pressure back. If you stay with me, I'll show you exactly how to do that. Silence creates a psychological vacuum. The person being ignored starts filling that silence with questions. What did I do wrong? Why won't they talk to me? How do I fix this? Slowly, the focus shifts. The problem stops being the conflict itself. The problem becomes getting the other person to acknowledge you again. And that's where the manipulation starts working. But there is another mechanism happening underneath all of this. In behavioral psychology, there's a concept called conditioning. It's the same principle used to train animals. Reward the behavior you want. Remove something when you want the behavior to stop. That's exactly what happened in our story. Over time, this teaches the other person a very specific lesson. Your emotional safety depends entirely on the other person's approval. And once that pattern is established, the power dynamic shifts completely. The person who can walk away emotionally, who can tolerate the silence, automatically holds the power in the relationship. That's why this tactic shows up in many different forms. Sometimes it's a partner who disappears for a day after a disagreement. Sometimes it's a friend who suddenly stops responding to messages. Sometimes it's a parent who becomes cold and distant the moment you step outside their expectations. The message underneath is always the same: your access to me is conditional. That's how the control is already in place. Now, when we look at these psychological mechanics, it's important to understand something first. Knowledge itself is neutral. These patterns are simply the hidden mechanics of human interaction, the small psychological levers that move emotions, reactions, and power in a conversation. The same insight that allows someone to manipulate another person can also allow someone to recognize the manipulation and refuse to play along. So what you do with this information is entirely your choice. The first principle to understand is something we can call the mirror reset. When someone suddenly cuts off communication, your instincts will push you in one direction, closing the gap. You want answers. You want to repair the connection. You want the silence to stop. That reaction is precisely what gives the tactic its power. The person creating the silence is waiting for the emotional chase, apologies, explanations, demands for a conversation. Each attempt confirms that the silence is working. The mirror reset interrupts that loop. Instead of chasing the reaction, you match the emotional stillness with calm detachment. You continue your routine, focus on your own priorities, and behave as if the silence is simply empty space rather than a punishment. When the tactic suddenly has no visible effect, the dynamic begins to shift. The silence stops functioning as a weapon and becomes exactly what it actually is: two people sitting in a quiet environment.
The second mechanism is what we can call the tactical gap. In most social interactions, the person who reacts first often gives up control of the pace. Silence, used strategically, does the opposite. When someone pushes a boundary or attempts to provoke a reaction, resisting the impulse to respond immediately can change the entire frame of the interaction. A short pause, a steady look, a moment of silence before returning to what you were doing. That brief vacuum tends to create discomfort in the other person. Many people rush to fill that empty space by explaining themselves, softening what they said, or stepping back from their position. The silence forces them to carry the weight of their own words. And finally, there is the most direct way to dismantle the tactic: the broken frame. Manipulative dynamics rely heavily on ambiguity. As long as the behavior remains unspoken, the silent treatment can operate as a psychological fog. Breaking the frame means naming the behavior calmly and directly. Something like, "If you need time to cool off, that's fine, but ignoring someone instead of talking about the issue doesn't solve anything." Once a tactic is exposed for what it is, it becomes much harder to use it as a tool of control.
If you want to understand more of the hidden psychological tactics people use every day, make sure to subscribe.